Welcome to this new edition of France 24 for the Talk of Paris. With us in Geneva, one of the leading figures of international affairs, Kofi Annan. Geneva, where he welcomes us, where he has set his new headquarters for his new activities, his new foundation, after 10 years in the UN. Hello, Kofi Annan.
Hello, I'm happy to see you again and to see you here.
With us in Geneva, Christian Macarian, who is a deputy editor of L'Express, the French news magazine, L'Express, where you will be able to read this week this exceptional interview with Kofi Annan. I would like to ask you, sir, is there a life after the UN?
Absolutely. There's life after the UN. It was exciting, 10 years, challenging, perplexing at times, but ultimately fulfilling the job I did the past 10 years. But that I've done that. Now I'm looking forward. There's a lot to be done. I'm very busy. I'm doing interesting things, and I'm very excited about that. So I can say without hesitation, there is indeed a very interesting life after the UN.
And you have launched a few foundations. One of them is Africa Progress, but you have also launched one on Africa, one on humanitarian action. Why so many foundations, and what is your goal with all these activities?
The Africa Progress Panel grew out of a commission which former Prime Minister Blair set up. The group which I'm chairing includes some people that you would know. It does include Michel Camdessus, Bob Geldof. We have had very serious discussions with the G8, with the African leaders, and we're on the verge of engaging the European Union. We think Africa has an opportunity to improve its economic conditions. It's a unique time in its history where most of the governments have positive economic growth, where civil society is now very active, and they are demanding that their governments perform. So we have a unique opportunity to really help Africa move forward. But Africa needs its international partners, and this is why we are engaging the G8. And we will continue to work with the donor community and with the Africans to ensure that the Millennium Development Goals are generally met by 2015.
And then you have AGRA.
We have AGRA. AGRA
Alliance for Green Africa.
Yeah, exactly. Africa is the only continent that cannot feed itself as we speak. It is the only continent where millions are living on food aid. And yet it can be a fertile continent. It is the only continent that has not gone through a green revolution. Alliance for Green Revolution is determined to work with the Africans, not at the ministries, level of ministries, but with the ministries and the farmers at the grassroots level to ensure that the farmers have the right inputs in terms of the seeds that are high yielding, resist pests, water generation, marketing, storage, and really hope that in 10 years or so we should be able to double or triple food production in Africa.
And then you have the Global Humanitarian Forum.
We have the Global Humanitarian Forum, which is a Swiss foundation set up by the Swiss government, which I'm chairing. And the idea here is to try and bring together once a year key humanitarian players to discuss major issues. Issues like the impact of the environment on disasters on the individual. How do we deal with these mega and huge humanitarian crisis we are facing? To be able to react and deal with these issues, you need everyone at the table. Governments, civil society, NGOs, the private sector, the military, who often have the logistics to help.
When you see this organization and the huge task that you have ahead, one might say that you are creating a new little UN on the border of Lake Geneva.
Oh, not at all, not at all. We are not, first of all, we are not going to compete with people who are already operating in the field. We hope that what we do will enhance their capacity and will allow them to do their work better. I hope it is not just going to be a talk shop, but something that leads to action and helps people on the ground.
Do you feel more independent now that you've left the United Nations?
Let's say there are less constraints. There are less constraints. You are freer in the sense that you are not working for an institution, and you don't necessarily have to balance every little action you want to take. But of course, there's also, you have responsibility, and it's a question of being sensitive to concerns around that. But you are freer. It's not like the UN, where on some key issues you need to consult the Security Council, you need to go to the General Assembly. In that sense, I am freer. And I can also choose and pick what I want to get involved in. At the UN, as Secretary General, you go to bed at night wondering, what crisis am I going to wake up to, and how am I going to cope?
Were you really free, or were you the prisoner of the UN, in fact?
Let me speak personally. I was neither a prisoner nor completely free, 100% free, because on some issues you needed to bring in the Security Council to work with them. Even when we get the agreement of the Security Council, you need the resources and the budget to carry it out. And they are the masters of the purse. So one cannot be entirely free in that situation. But I was free enough to speak out on certain key issues, to make proposals to the member states and to the Council, to press the Council for some action. Last summer, for example, when the Israeli-Hezbollah war broke out, I was the first to press for cessation of hostilities, and became very actively engaged, working with the government, working in the Security Council, and also with governments to provide troops for us to establish an international stabilization force in Lebanon. So you can take initiative, you can be free, but within certain limits.
As you know, Mr. Kofi Annan, the tradition in this program is to go back to the past and see the profile of the guest to understand better the future. So I would like you to look at this profile, which has been done by one of the journalists of France 24. Please, let's look at it together.
Kofi Annan may be quiet, but he's certainly not lacking in charisma. Well known for his polite but frank manner, some describe him as the best Secretary-General the United Nations has had. Annan is the first black African to be elected to such high diplomatic ranks within the organisation. Annan studied in Switzerland and the US before joining the UN in 1962, when he worked as a civil servant at the World Health Organization. But as his career progressed, he was faced with bigger and tougher challenges. As Assistant Secretary-General, Annan was in charge of peacekeeping forces during the 1994 Rwandan genocide. In 1997, he became the 7th Secretary-General of the UN. He described the post as the most impossible job on earth and spoke of his intention to reform the UN.
Obviously, this is not going to be an easy mission.
Among Annan's main efforts as head of the UN, tackling war, famine and disease in North Africa, campaigning for women's rights and fighting against AIDS. Once simply a respected civil servant, he became an international superstar. In 2001, Annan and the UN received the Nobel Peace Prize. The same year, he was re-elected Secretary-General. Annan's popularity in the US was somewhat less clear-cut when he became the man who stood up to the Bush administration over Iraq. He was shaken when the American invasion went ahead in March 2003 and considered it a personal diplomatic failure. Whoa. Adding to his troubles, the UN's reputation was tarnished when tales of sex scandals in Africa and the oil for food bribes affair hit the headlines. His son was implicated in the scandal. One of Annan's main goals in his last months as Secretary-General was to work on the crisis in Darfur. He was unable to find a solution to end the conflict before he stood down in 2006. But for Annan, there is life after the UN. The 69-year-old's president of numerous organisations, including the African Progress Panel, and some would like to see him as the future president of Ghana.
So today, Mr. Kofi Annan, is there something more that you regret you have not done, or what would you have done differently?
I think I had an opportunity to do lots of things, and definitely with my colleagues and the support of the member states and peoples around the world, we achieved a lot at the United Nations. There were things that I wish we could have done differently. It's a well-known fact that I wish we had been able to stop the war in Iraq, because I was worried about the consequences. And I did speak out and stand up.
And recently, Mr. Sarkozy, the French president, said that history gave France proved right. What do you say? Do you agree with him?
The French position on the war was right. I had the same position, and many members of the Security Council had that position. And this is why the United States could not get the votes to get the Council to approve the war. I think the Council, in that instance, acted exactly the way it was supposed to act. After serious reflection and discussion, decided no. And I think that was right. And I think, in a way, it redeemed the UN. It would have been disastrous if the UN had voted for the war in Iraq and for us to live with the consequences that we see today.
Do you have any nostalgia of that period when you were Secretary General? I mean, you had a lot of power, you had a lot of means.
I don't know if it's power, let's say influence. One had considerable influence. One had access. One had the opportunity to participate and play a role. And I did all that. It was, as I said, it was the most exciting job and perhaps the most frustrating and the most challenging one. I really have no nostalgia. I've moved on. There are lots of things to do. There are very exciting things to be done. And some of the things that we discussed at the UN, or I hope could have been done under the UN and we were not able to do, I'm going to be able to engage in it right now. And it covers a whole range of issues we've discussed.
We've seen that one of your foundation, Alliance for Green Revolution in Africa, is being done with two huge private foundations, Bill Gates Foundation and the Rockefeller Foundation. Aren't you surprised by the huge power of these private groups compared to the UN or other public foundations? Do you see there a trend, and how do you see the future of the world? Are they going to compete with the UN?
Well, I think the Alliance for Green Revolution has two founding members. You're right, Gates and Rockefeller. But the alliance is also going to be open to others, and others can join the fund. It's not closed. The approach of the alliance, our approach is open, is transparent. We will work with anyone who shares our mission. And there are lots of people and institutions who are concerned about African agriculture.
But does it mean that the UN doesn't do what it should do, for example?
No, it doesn't mean that. It means that there's such a huge task to be done that we all need to work in partnership to get it done. Governments, international organizations, the private sector, NGOs, and we all need to work together to do it. What is important is that we've recognized that there is a major problem in Africa.
As Africa is your priority, I would like you to listen to one of the questions by a former president of Médecins Sans Frontières. Let's listen to him.
Bonjour, Monsieur Annan.
My question is on the emerging diseases. During the last 30 years, various new diseases have appeared. SARS, Ebola, and of course AIDS. But there's a feeling that it took the UN, and the World Health Organization in particular, ages to realize how devastating these new diseases are in terms of international and private security. What do you think the UN should do now that everybody seems to be aware that these new diseases are really dangerous?
Let me first of all say that the UN takes these issues very, very seriously. I pushed for the formation and the creation of the Global Fund for HIV/AIDS, malaria and tuberculosis in 2002 when it was established. Since then, we have given grants of up to $7 billion. Later on this month, on the 25th, 26th of September, I'll be in Berlin, where we are doing a replenishment conference, trying to raise about $6 to $7 billion to continue our work. And I've urged all governments to give and give generously so that we can bring the epidemic under control.
Have you heard that France might reduce its contribution by 15%? And what do you say about it?
Yes, I have read it in the press, and I genuinely and sincerely hope it is wrong. France, that is not correct. France has played a very important role in this. It's been one of the leaders. I remember my discussions with President Chirac and other President Blair, President Bush, when we set up the fund. France has been there and in fact is one of the top donors to the fund. And the fund has done so much good. And I hope France will sustain its contribution and if possible increase it. I urge President Sarkozy to maintain that leadership role that France has played.
Christian?
70% of the international interventions in the world happen in Africa. And half of the conflicts in the world take place in Africa. Are you still optimistic for the future of the continent?
No, it's a very good question. It's a question and a situation that has bothered me for years. There's good news. Conflicts have been reducing. In fact, in 1997, there were 41 conflicts. Today, there are 31 of them. But you're right, we still have Darfur. We have other conflicts that have not been resolved. The African people want security, peace, and stability. They want to share in the prosperity that other parts of the world are having. And that in itself is a very powerful movement, putting pressures on political leaders to do the right thing.
Kofi Annan, we reached the end of the first part of the program. I would like you to please watch with us the news on France 24, and we will be back in a few minutes. Welcome back to the second part of the Talk of Paris in Geneva with our special guest, the former UN Secretary General Kofi Annan. So let's go immediately to one of the delicate questions. You expressed your regrets, Darfur. Let's listen to one of the questions of our viewers immediately.
President Sarkozy and Prime Minister Gordon Brown, in a recent article about Darfur, have called on all sides to lay down their arms and to respect a ceasefire without delay. Would you agree that an immediate ceasefire is the most important step needed in Darfur at the moment? And will you use all of your influence in order to secure that goal in the coming weeks?
Kofi Annan?
Absolutely. I agree with Prime Minister Gordon Brown that the key to the Darfur crisis is a political settlement. There's no military solution. And I think all the protagonists recognize this. And I also applaud the UN and the Secretary General Ban Ki-moon for the recent energetic efforts they've made to bring all the rebel groups together, except Abdul Wahid, who couldn't leave Paris, who didn't leave Paris to join them, to formulate a common platform for the rebels to be able to sit at the table with the government and negotiate. The key is political settlement. And that is why all those with influence, not just myself or the UN, but political leaders who have influence either on the rebels or the government of Sudan, must bring that to bear.
Christian?
Don't you think Darfur has shown clearly the limits of the UN action in the world, I mean, in such an accurate crisis?
I agree. Darfur highlights some of the weaknesses of the international system. But sometimes when we refer to the UN, we tend to give an alibi to the governments. It is when the Council speaks with one voice that it has its greatest impact. Where you have divisions, it's extremely difficult.
We have a question from one of the president of the movement Urgence in Darfur, Jackie Mamou, that you will see on your screen. I read it very quickly to you. It says, you have qualified that Darfur was hell on earth. There were multiple resolutions. There were demands to the government to stop its exaction. There were a lot of effort to deploy a humanitarian head, and there was no success on the ground. So, and in fact, Sudan also stopped the Sudanese government to have this international tribunal to do its job. So, what is the credibility today of the UN? Asked Jackie Mamou, who is president of Urgence Darfur.
I think what is very clear is that things have not gone as one would have liked in Darfur. But we need to look at the facts also. In the Darfur situation, there are many actors. Even the Security Council resolution indicated that for the UN to deploy the troops, we needed the cooperation and consent of the Sudanese government. In the absence of that consent, what do? The international community was not prepared to impose this on the Sudanese government, and I doubt if it could have done it. Secondly, even if it wanted to, which were the countries that was going to give the troops for the imposition? Governments that have the power and the means today have major military operations in Afghanistan, in Iraq, and elsewhere. Do you really believe that they would have been ready to take on a third challenge in Sudan in a forceful manner? But international presence without a political settlement is not a solution.
Still about the role of the UN and human rights, there is a question from the president of Reporters Sans Frontières, Robert Ménard. Let's listen to it.
Monsieur le secrétaire général, avant de quitter les Nations Unies...
Before leaving the UN, you set up a new structure in charge of the human rights. You replaced the Human Rights Commission that proved to be ineffective with a council. But today, what are the results of this council? First, the worst countries, the most repressive, still avoid sanctions, just like before. And moreover, the special envoys, whose job is to make sure that human rights are being respected in different countries, are being cut out one by one. It's quite depressing. Don't you think that the human rights matter should be discussed directly with the states and that it's not a task for the UN?
Kofi Annan?
First of all, let me say that the Council has been in existence for about 1 year. And we have to accept that it takes time to establish institutions and make sure they work effectively, efficiently, and constructively. The Council has had a difficult start, but I will not write off the Council yet. I think the pressure on governments, on institutions to respect human rights, to respect the Universal Declaration of Human Rights is very strong. And in the end, we are going to be able to get the Council to do what it was set up to do. Yes, it's difficult, but it's only the beginning.
Let's go forward to one of the other crises of the moment, Iran versus America, Europe, and so on. President of Iran is challenging, defying still today all the resolutions of the UN, to the point where the United States and maybe France are considering sanctions outside the UN to go around the veto from Russia and China. Are you worried about that, or is it a necessity to put pressure on Tehran?
I think the pressure has been on for quite some time and is been escalated. There's also been attempts to dialogue and find a solution. And I think the dialogue will still continue. It's not off the table. This is a threat, it is a threat to the broader international community. And it is preferable that it is dealt with within the UN by all the member states. I hope that they will find a way of working with their partners in the Security Council and not envisage sanctions outside the Security Council, because it does weaken the Council itself. It also allows room for others to manipulate the situation.
Do you believe that, or are you worried that George Bush might launch an attack against Iran if Ahmadinejad does not comply?
I would caution against any attempt to go unilateral route or a route that breaks away from the Security Council. Obviously, we have a very, very delicate situation in the Middle East. We have a situation in the Middle East where we are seeing so many conflicts. In the past, when we talk of military conflicts in the Middle East, we focus on Palestine and Israel. But today you have Iraq, you have Palestine and Israel, you have Lebanon and Israel, you have Syria and Israel, you have Palestinian civil war almost. You have divisions within Lebanon. We have the Iranian crisis. It's a region we need to handle very, very carefully. Any miscalculation can complicate the situation and make it much worse than it is today. Yes, we should insist that Iran must honor its obligations. Iran must respect Security Council resolutions and its obligations under the Atomic Agency regulations. But that having been said, the means we use to get them to comply has to be very carefully thought out and very carefully chosen. We cannot afford any other conflicts in the region.
What kind of solution do you see for Iraq now?
That the Americans, in a way, are trapped, some piégés, trapped in the sense that they cannot stay and they cannot leave. What is important is that as international community, we all recognize that Iraq is everybody's problem. A country like Iraq, at the center of Middle East, if we do not all come together to pacify Iraq and get it right, and things were to get even worse, the whole world will pay a price.
Did you think that the trip of Bernard Kouchner, for the first time ever, a French Prime Minister going to Baghdad since the war, is it a good thing?
If one sees it in the context of saying, we have a problem, we as international community need to work together to resolve it. Let's stop worrying about where we stood before the war, who supported the war and who did not. Let's work together to resolve it. In that context, I think it was helpful and it was right.
Concretely, sir, do you think a complete American withdrawal, which is not yet planned, could change anything to the region?
I think the Americans cannot stay in Iraq indefinitely. And so sooner or later, they will have to withdraw. But the timing of the withdrawal, in my judgment, has to be optimal. They have to withdraw at a time when considerable progress has been made on the file of political reconciliation. That the parties, the Iraqi parties, have reached a certain understanding of how they are going to live together. That they have been able to put through the reforms that will ensure fair sharing of power, fair sharing of resources, and adequate application of laws and rules, creating a situation where if they withdrew, it will not lead to a major explosion. But if they were to withdraw precipitously or before one has attained that level of potential stability and things were to go wrong, they will have a great responsibility on their shoulders.
You mentioned the Middle East. Tony Blair has a chance to succeed where everybody has failed so far?
Tony Blair is a very experienced politician. Even if he doesn't resolve it completely, he believes he can make a difference.
What do you believe?
It's a very difficult challenge. It's a very difficult challenge, and I don't think one can expect Tony Blair alone to do it. Tony has to have the full support. It's not an easy task that he's taken on. And besides, I don't think we have much time.
Christian?
One nation is trying to take a bigger role in Middle East. It's Russia. There is a kind of comeback. What do you think about the way the Russians play with the remains of Cold War?
Russia is an important country. and would want to play a role internationally. And I think we should be open to that. I'm one of those who had never accepted the idea that we live in a unipolar world. We have many poles, and Russia is one of those poles, and we have to take them into consideration. The right construction, they can make a contribution. But I note, and even from the tenor of your question, that people always suspect Russian moves, and I don't think it's always justified. If you step back a little bit and see what has happened since the collapse, you see the expansion of NATO, you see the expansion of the European Union, you see what has happened in Georgia, Ukraine, geopolitical moves in Central Asia.
In China.
And in China. You will feel you are being encircled. And then when the Americans come and indicate we're going to put missiles in Poland and Czechoslovakia, you believe you're a sitting duck and that you're going to be, unless there's very serious dialogue and discussion about these things, the Russians will react. And a Russian leader who does not react will probably have problems with his people.
But are you worried that might maybe be the beginning of a new confrontation between Russia and the rest of the...
We need not. It need not become a new confrontation between Russia and the West or any other group. It depends on how we respond. If we were to say that maybe they have a point, maybe they are worried, maybe they have misunderstood our intentions, and we should engage them and do it, and not react instinctively to strong statements they may make, and say, let's sit and talk. Nobody wants a new division, a new Cold War, and I'm not sure the Russians want it. They are now part of the world. They've moved so far away from the Cold War mentality that I'm not even sure, even if they wanted to go back, it's going to be that easy. We need to be a bit more self-critical. We need to not have knee-jerk reaction that there goes the Russians again and all that. You know, I'm speaking very frankly because I think it's an issue that we need to really look at.
What is your judgment about Sarkozy as a president?
He's been very active. He appears very decisive. And you talk of giving a new tone to French foreign policy. I think he's already started that. I see a change in the attitude of the French government. I see a certain change in the attitude of the French people. There seems to be a new optimism. And I think France will have to work with its other European partners to give Europe the weight most of them want to give it. And I think by cooperating with Europe and making Europe stronger, France and all of Europe become strong.
Will you have some time to come and see one of the games of the World Rugby Cup in Paris? Are you a fan?
No, I'm not a crazy rugby fan. I will watch football, tennis, and all that. I will watch it on television, but I won't go to the stadium to watch it. I know Les Bleus, they are very hopeful, and they seem to have done very well this season. And I'm sure they're expecting to bring home.
And the South Africans are very strong too.
They are very strong.
Monsieur Kofi Annan, sir, thank you very much for your time. Thank you, Christian Macarian. I would like to repeat that you will be able to read this great interview in L'Express this week. And we will see you next week on France 24 for a new edition of the Talk of Paris. Merci et à bientôt.
Thank you very much.